Oh, we're live.
We are live. Is this on?
Yes.
Okay. I'm not used to this. Alright. Well, let's go ahead and pray. Father in heaven, thank you for this time that we can gather together and discuss topics of justice, topics of law, topics of representation through you as the mediator between the judge of the earth and the law, which is our adversary against our sin. Please help us to be clear-minded and focusing on your word to learn the truth in it. And please bless our discussion tonight. In Jesus' name we pray, amen. So I recommended the topic of courts, juries, and justice reform. It's probably the most broad topic I could think of without getting into too much nuance, which is what I'm prone to. I posted... Yeah, if you didn't know. But I posted a bunch of questions in preparation. I'm going to read through those questions as the overall topic, and then I'm going to focus mostly on juries and some personal experiences within juries as either a juryman or as somebody on the stand. And so the topics are as follows. Question 1, what is biblical justice and injustice? How swift should biblical justice be executed? Do our modern courts reflect biblical justice? Are juries biblical? What are their purpose, and does that purpose align with Scripture? Should Christians serve on juries, and if so, how should they prepare? How should Christians prepare if they do serve on juries? And lastly, is there systemic injustice within the courts? If so, how can we address the problems of injustice within the courts biblically, and specifically as an exterior person, because very unlikely that any of us will be a judge in a courtroom, but we may be a juryman in a courtroom, and we may be a witness in a courtroom. So how do we address the problems, if there are any, which I think right off the bat we can say yes, you can point to any individual instance where there is injustice and say yes, there's that example of injustice. But is there systemic injustice? Is there something wrong with the system itself, or is there something wrong with how the system operates that makes it systemic? So to the first question, what is biblical justice and injustice? And with any apologetics, you need to define your terms. So Webster 1828, the definition of justice, that he has a series of definitions, but this is the summary of the first one. Justice is the virtue which consists in giving to everyone what is his due, practical conformity to the laws and to the principles in the dealings of men with each other, honesty, integrity, and then justice is distributive and commutative, meaning justice is distributed from both the laws and the rulers, and it is communal in the sense of my dealings with you, and he defines that as a more economic thing in trades, or if I purchase from you, I'm not going to give you less money than is due, otherwise you're not going to give your product to me. So it's more of an economic sense there. So that's the definition of justice. The definition of biblical justice is implied because it's the virtue. Justice is a virtue. It's not just something abstract. It's not apart from ethics. It is a virtue in and of itself. And the only virtue or ethic as Christians would be from the Bible. So you can't define justice in a vacuum as a Christian. You need to define justice as a biblical virtue. And
can I add something too?
Yeah.
And some of that is you need to also define what is our due. What would that mean in the biblical terms? Because obviously, especially today, we have very different concepts of what our due is. People think they have a right to health care. They have a right to... If you say you have a right, you're due it, right? And so
you think you're due it.
Yeah, you think you are. So that's the I think an important thing when we talk about the biblical notion of justice. We need to be talking, what does the Bible say is our due? What is our just due? often when David speaks, he says, plead my cause. You know I'm righteous. And when he says that to God, we'd almost think like, why is somebody, as a man, why would you say plead my cause? Because we're all like, we're sinners. We don't really want God to judge us. But David repeatedly says, judge me. And when he does so, he's actually basically speaking of vindicate him against his enemy. Show that what he's done is right and bear witness and testimony to the truth in that situation. I think that becomes an important point in modern culture, in our modern culture especially, is asking biblically, what is our due? What can we reasonably expect from, should we expect from God's law? And how can we make that the laws of our land? And how much do our laws already reflect that? How much do we need to make them reflect that? Or where is it lacking, if it is? And there are some things I think we have great, some things we don't have very great. But I just want to clarify.
Okay. So, but to that point of, again, defining
Just for the
terms,
record, you didn't.
What's that?
Just
he
for the record.
elaborated.
Yeah.
But I am treating the definition that Webster gives as the concise biblical definition here, because you can define it in many ways that is not
You're still
reflective.
defining our due.
Right, our due. It is just it is equal punishment for crime. So it's, I'm not punishing you
So we're still
one
on
way
justice.
and you right. I'm not judging you a different way than somebody else. You're both
it's
equal
equality.
under the law of God. And so a concise or a an added point on the topic of virtue as justice being a virtue, Psalm 97:2, I think it's 1 and 2 actually. The Lord reigns, let the earth be glad, let the distant shores rejoice. Clouds and darkness surround him. Righteousness and justice are the foundation of his throne, speaking of God. And then also Psalm 89:14, righteousness and justice are the foundation of your throne. Love and faithfulness go before you. So righteousness and justice are co-equal foundations of God's throne. So you can't split justice apart from righteousness, because otherwise there's no foundation of God's throne. And the throne room is always the place where people are judged.
Mm-hmm.
Solomon had the Hall of Justice in his palace, and that's where the famous two mothers and the babies in front of him, and he's saying, well, you're not settling this, let's cut the baby in half. That was considered justice. That was in the Hall of Justice. Obviously he didn't do it because he found out who the mother was, but that story happened within the Hall of Justice. So the how is justice executed and what is injustice? So justice is executed, one, directly by God through his church, through his providential workings in time, through people he raises up for positions of power to judge. And you have probably pretty much the entirety of Deuteronomy, you have examples of how the more nuance of how justice is executed. So for example, Deuteronomy 16, it has God speaking to Moses, saying, and to Israel, you shall appoint judges and officers in all your gates, which the Lord your God gives you according to your tribes, and they shall judge the people with just judgment. You shall not pervert justice, you shall not show partiality, nor take a bribe, for the bribe blinds the eye of the wise and twists the words of the righteous. So you have the principle of multiple judges using the same law around all of the 12 tribes. So in America, we have district courts, we have Supreme Court, we have different layers of judges and courts which are supposed to, in our system, use the same law throughout all the courts. And so that was the same principle then, using the Bible throughout all the tribes, and you would have judges in every gate. In every town, every city, there would be a judge. And you also have nuance of how they're supposed to execute justice. You're not supposed to pervert justice. No partiality, no bribe taking. So judges couldn't
Take a gift.
take a gift, or go to elaborate dinners or lobbying sessions or whatever. That there would not be any, there'd be that buffer between the judge and the people in the sense of he is a common person, but he's not a common person. He's representing God himself as the judge, but he's from their camp. He's from their tribe. And also Deuteronomy 24:17, you shall not pervert justice due to the stranger or the fatherless, nor take a widow's garment as a pledge. So that again, just because somebody's coming in as a stranger, once they're entering your gate, your town, your city, your country, an immigrant, whatever, you treat them like you would treat one of your own. You use the same law, the same punishment if they commit a crime. And just because they might not have a father or a mother, you don't treat them any differently. And not taking a widow's garment as a pledge goes back to the bribe. No, you don't take what is due somebody, one of their possessions, as part of your, your payment, or your, that essentially is stealing.
Could that
more.
actually be referring to, let's suppose a widow was actually guilty of something, right, and she could not pay for it. It seems to be saying you cannot accept, it has to do with what they're due, but you cannot accept her cloak as a pledge because that's her due. Like that's hers. And the Bible talks about this with the poor person, that when they're destitute, there are certain things you should not keep for yourself, even if they're doing it as collateral, right? So they're saying, hey, I'll make a payment, but I'm going to use my cloak as collateral. But it's the only cloak they have. It's what they wrap themselves in at night to keep them warm. The Bible says, you shall not keep it. If you keep that, you're perverting justice. And that kind of gets to the point where we don't always think that way, and maybe it's because we don't really have very many genuinely impoverished people to draw on that example for. But that would be an example of, no, you're actually not allowed. In this case, it seems to be saying you can't accept that cloak from a widow as collateral because you're destitute. They need that.
And I'm going to tie that verse to a practical example, not in a widow's situation, but something similar later when we get to jury stuff. So the next question in the summary, how swift is biblical justice executed? Proverbs 21:15, when justice is done, it brings joy to the righteous but terror to the evildoers.
I couldn't hear you.
When justice is done, it brings joy to the righteous but terror to the evildoers. And I wasn't able to get all the verses I wanted typed out, but there are other verses you're probably familiar with that have when wicked king rules, the people perish. When there's unrighteousness, the people mourn, stuff like that. So there's the principle of the longer something evil or unjust is existing, the longer and worse the terror to the righteous happens. So if we have a wicked king, we are going to suffer under that wickedness, and that's going to become expounded. It's going to get worse and worse the longer that person's there. And you have the example, well, obviously Northam, but you have the example of Ahab and Jezebel. As their reign continued, they started to do worse and worse things as time went on.
That's because God leaves the wicked to themselves.
Right. So
That was one of the most profound lessons that I learned when I started Bible study.
yeah.
I'm sorry, what was that verse about justice that you just read? I'm trying
Proverbs 21:15. This is New King James, so it might
There's another one. I was trying to find it. I was trying to figure out how it's phrased. But Ecclesiastes 8:11 says, because sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily, therefore the heart of the sons of men is fully set in them to do evil.
Right.
So that's another one. Like you can't. And then you've probably heard the motto: "Justice delayed is justice denied."
Right.
And this would get to that point. It's a motto for a reason.
And that it's a motto for a reason, exactly, because it's biblical.
Yep.
And usually it's used wrongly to be like, I want it now. I want justice now. We want it now. And you see all these protests, I want it now, isn't actually biblical because justice has a process. You have to have a court. You have to have evidence. You have to have witnesses. You have to have all this process. There's a process.
I think it's important. It says sentence, so it seems like
Right.
when the sentence is given, whatever it is. Maybe it's restitution. Maybe it's delaying that should be unacceptable. It's like you should never prolong that. Once there's been a judging of all the cases, the evidence, the witnesses, and you know this is the sentence, you shouldn't delay that outcome. And we have that's what death row is. It's literally a delay. It's like, why are we doing that?
And that's, again, the sentence is the final act.
Yeah.
So after the sentence happens, unless there's new evidence that shows the sentence was wrong or the person was innocent or guilty, whatever it is, that case is done. It's put on a shelf. It's done. And going back to the original definition of justice in the sense of commerce, once I purchase that car from you, my payment, once I'm finished paying it, I'm done.
It's yours, yeah.
It's mine. It should be my property. So you have that bookend of crime to sentence. And how swiftly should biblical justice be executed? You can't put a number of days on that. But you can have the principle of sooner the better, and you should not delay. And you also have the problem of bribery. The longer, just say capital murder or extortion or whatever the mass crime is, the longer it's delayed, the more possibility of perverted justice, because maybe the judge might get a bribe, maybe the jury might be a hung jury, or maybe the jury gets tainted with wrong information, whatever the situation is. So the longer the sentencing is put off, within reason, within wisdom, the less likely a good sentence will come. So the next
Well, and also, typically the person on trial is being held.
right.
And so you're being held, you haven't been found guilty yet, but you're still imprisoned. Unless you pay a bail if that's available.
So I'm going to skip my next question and save that for last about modern courts. But are juries biblical? What are their purpose, and does that purpose align with Scripture? Should Christians serve on juries, and if so, how should they prepare? So I found this article from Church of the Great God. I don't even know where it's from. I was just typing, are juries biblical on Google and reading all the articles that came up. So this church says, the Bible teaches that Christians should not involve themselves in judging others, Matthew 7:1. God's people ought to decide matters within the church, but they should not sit in judgment of those outside the church. Notice, this is what this church is claiming.
So he's just reading an article.
It's just this church is claiming that it is wrong to serve on juries if you are a Christian. And their reasoning is, and they have a bunch of verses here that I'm not going to read all of them, but their foundational verse is Matthew 7:1. And that's, judge not that ye be not judged.
Yeah, but there's more to that verse.
Exactly. And
So that right away says, should we give credence to this author?
Right.
If he only used that segment.
Right. He's using others, and I'm going to
I
get
know,
to
but
some
are
of the
they
others.
all segment,
Right.
I don't know much, but I know there's a lot more to that than that.
Sure.
Right.
Because you just have to put 1 Corinthians 6 as an example.
Yeah, he quotes 1 Corinthians 6 about not going to law against your brother, and all these other verses.
Well, you got to be very. I feel like 1 Corinthians 6 actually explicitly says Christians are to judge people outside the church. So that's where I was going to go with
They
that.
are not?
No, they're explicitly told
Yeah.
that they're
Yeah.
supposed to. And Paul chides them that if you're supposed to be judging the world, and you can't judge among yourselves,
Right.
you're
I
being
mean,
foolish, right? So he's basically using an argument of, I don't know what you'd say, lesser the greater. Basically, here's a small thing you're failing at, and because you're failing at the small thing when you should be
How
doing
can the
greater
big one-
things, it's like, he's like, I mean, he really upbraids them in a way when he's really doing
Tends to do that a lot.
Yeah, he does.
Yeah.
He does.
But they're
$6 million man.
back to your point, Dutch, the judge not lest ye be judged. The rest of the chapter speaks for itself, and everyone kind of scribbles the rest of the chapter out and just
Right.
focuses on that one. So the rest of it is, for with what judgment ye judge, you will be judged, and what measure ye use, it will be measured back to you. And it goes on from there. So basically, if you're arguing from the position of Christians should not serve on juries because of that verse, what you're actually arguing is, I'm too scared to be judged by the punishment I'm willing to give. Because if you look at the verse in context, it's saying, if you judge Jesse in this way, expect to be judged back that way. And if you're too scared to judge him in that way, that means you don't want to be judged that same way. Understand?
And if he, that's why he's calling it a sin of hypocrisy. It's like, because that's you being inconsistent. Because
Right.
if you're going to give that judgment out, but you're not willing to receive the judgment, there's a problem of not being consistent with the method.
Then doesn't it go on to say that you're obligated to judge?
Yeah, later on, because it's saying
Yeah,
judge
there's,
righteously.
Yeah, that's in John. So technically it's a different place.
Mm-hmm.
But he does mention, if you take his parable where he
Right.
says, "Fool, take the beam out of your eye so you can see
Yeah.
the speck." He says, "Take the beam out so you can take the speck out." It would seem to me that is indicating that a concern for justice being done and you sin in your brother, it should be a concern, but you gotta make sure you're not being hypocritical when you're doing it.
Right. And it's saying remove the plank from your own eye to remove the speck in your brother's. It's telling you need to judge yourself according to what you're willing to judge somebody else. So it's actually saying, yes,
Not telling you not to judge though.
Yes.
it's telling to judge yourself first.
Right. So,
Examine yourself before you judge somebody else. It's not saying don't judge your neighbor. It's saying judge yourself by that
There's an
same
order,
standard, which should be the Bible,
Yeah.
before you judge your neighbor.
Yeah.
And that goes along with the two greatest commandments: love God, love your neighbor. If you love God, you're going to judge yourself according to God's standards. If you love your neighbor, you're going to judge your neighbor according to God's standards, not your own standards.
Right.
So it has that, even though they like to quote the first, 6 words, or 8 words.
they do all the time.
Yeah, there's a lot more there that says, well, yes, you should be judging, but here's how. So obviously, the foundation of their argument not to serve on juries is wrong. Their entire premise is wrong right off the bat. But it goes on to say, where is this? It goes on to say further, looking at how lawyers pick jurymen when there's the prosecution and the defense. They ask you questions and all that stuff. In that process, this author of this article is saying you should either have a written statement or make yourself unappealing to the lawyers on both the defense and prosecution so that they don't pick you.
So he's telling you a lie.
Right. He is telling you
Okay.
be
Make yourself unappealing.
unappealing,
Truthfully.
Oh yeah, you're true.
Robin finds me
Well,
unappealing regularly.
but
You probably could.
here's my argument of why it is a lie. It's saying, let me actually find where it is. This is
While you're looking, I was picked to serve on a federal jury in Philadelphia one time, and we had a small real estate company, and I was being sued because it happens. It was a woman who was suing a casino because she slipped on the outside sidewalk, and they said they asked the question before we got individual. They asked us as a group, anyone here have a problem with someone suing in a case like that? And I never experienced anything. I was very young. I didn't never experience anything like that. And I said, well, I do. I'm being sued right now over something that's stupid. Man, they had me out of there. I was home.
right. So like that's the thing though.
But I didn't fabricate anything.
Right. If you're honest and they don't pick you, that's not your fault. That's they want a specific kind of jury, and they're trying to pick that specific kind of jury, which is fine if they think that your personal experiences or your belief system will cause you to pervert justice for their side of the argument, they're not going to pick you.
I don't think I was, in today's world, I don't know that I would say pervert justice, just pervert their side of the argument.
Right.
Yeah, I
Right.
know.
Their
I think we're gonna
definition of
get into
justice.
that because I was thinking a lot about it. I think we have a broader problem, just like our culture's illiterate about what justice is.
Mhm.
So how are you, even if you get a room packed full of people, it's just a feel fest.
Where
I
do you
mean,
start?
even
Where do you
even
work
in
on
like
this?
a mock, I've done a
Mm-hmm.
mock jury, and that's supposedly like legal students. It was like it's literally a mock trial, and people are judging things based on like, well, if this is true, then
Right.
if this, then this.
Right.
But it's not really a logical art. It's more like if I feel this, then this.
And I'm going to get to my experiences in a jury room, kind of 12-acre room. Man, it's a great thing. All right, but this author, there are ways to excuse yourself from a jury because of work or whatever if you have proof, and if you have religious convictions not to. So you can write a statement and say, because of my religious convictions, I excuse myself. And this author is saying you should do that. If you are a Christian, you should always excuse yourself from being on juries because of your religious convictions. And what he is saying there is that your belief in the Bible, cornerstone of the throne of God, should be excused from the hall of justice in America.
Yeah, what a nonsense.
And it is very unfortunate because this is actually pretty standard. You don't really hear about it, but people are like, oh, I don't want to be a part of this. I have other things to do. I have shopping. I have whatever. I'm just going to excuse myself and go about my merry way. But when you get a summons to a jury, even if you're not ultimately selected, you should always follow through. I would argue that if you are a Christian that believes in the Bible, you are almost commanded, not verbatim, but you are commanded to exercise justice in the gates. As a part of the priesthood of believers, the followers of Jesus Christ, you are supposed to exercise justice wherever you are. And if you're given the opportunity to serve on a jury, you should take that, not because you want to bring in a Bible and read all of Deuteronomy to them, but you want to use the principles of not delaying justice, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, and no deceitful information, no partiality, all of those principles which are already in our legal system. There are laws against perjury. What was perjury? It's lying before the judge, lying in the courtroom. And in the Bible, the punishment for perjury, lying under oath, essentially, is that if you're using an extreme example of murder, if you're a witness and you say that man killed the victim and you're lying, you would be punished with the same crime that you accused the defendant for. So if I said you're a murderer and it turned out he was innocent, I would get the death penalty. That's how serious.
Is that part of the
proven, though.
Mosaic laws?
Yeah.
Yes.
But that would
You
have
just
to
made me
be.
think. The Mosaic laws were pretty harsh.
Oh yeah. Oh, in some ways.
I mean, they
really
weren't
are.
a love fest.
No.
Right. But that's how
That still has to be proven,
serious.
right? So it's not
Right,
that
of
if there's
course.
not enough evidence to actually give a verdict that therefore, now anyone who gave testimonies on a chopping block.
Right. No.
And really, when you ask how could you prove that, there aren't very many situations where you could. Really,
Right.
in most murder trials, you don't really have much really real testimony. You have a lot of circumstantial evidence, etc. Most of them will be acquitted. But it's mostly there as a disincentive to lie under
Right.
oath in a murder or
And-
in
and-
any
exactly.
trial.
And that's kind of the point of the perjury laws
Yeah.
are don't lie, otherwise you're going to get it.
Yeah.
And if they find out you lied, you will get it.
Yeah.
So it's not that's an extreme example there.
Right, but if it was
But
like you gave
it's-
testimony, I saw so and so, and then there was actually evidence that an alibi bit you in the butt. Like, oh, actually, a bunch of people know you were here, and there's no way you could have been there to see a murder. That would be like, well, we know certifiably that you're just fabricating this, and that would be an example.
And another kind of adjacent thing to that is you're not going, if you're a witness or if you're a juryman, you're not going to put the testimony of one witness over that of another witness because of the status of the first witness. So if the first witness is a pastor, the second witness is a layman, you're not going to say, well, the pastor is a man of God, I'm going to listen to him, and he's a man, he can lie. Like, you treat the evidence as it is, you treat the testimony as it is, compare everything, and find the
And the
decision.
same thing with the defendant.
Mm-hmm.
And this is why, because there are obvious prejudices that can come, and often God actually curtails those prejudices by saying, love this person. So loving the stranger. Now, why is he saying love the stranger? It's not to say you give preferential treatment to someone who's not a native of your country. He would do that because there's a proclivity to not relate to someone like that, and maybe to be suspicious of someone like that. But you're still to judge that person on the same level as everyone else. Like, if there's not enough evidence, there's simply not enough evidence. So, you're in a trial, you're like, you know what? I know he's kind. He's a Christian. He's a liar, or whatever else. You're going to be like, oh, there's a lot of evidence. These kind of people have this kind of way of life. You still need to treat equality under the law. Evidence has the same law for the homeborn, for the slave, and for the stranger. Same exact law, same standard of evidence. And those are examples, just the idea that law is impartial. Like, you don't. But those are things that lawyers try really hard to eliminate as much as possible. Like, if you're someone of the mindset that's like you kind of said, well, he's a preacher, I should make deference to him. You're going to be out of there pretty much
Right.
as soon as they can find out that you have that prejudice, they're going to get rid of you. Pretty much any known prejudice is going to disqualify you from being a jury person.
Right. And a biblical example is King David. Nathan the prophet comes to him and judges him according to the law that David judged the nation with. He is like, you're the murderer. You're the one that did this, and here's why. And here's what your here's what your sentence is. So he gave no partiality as a prophet of God. And just because David was the king, the man after God's own heart, he didn't give partiality to that. So I think that would be the best example. Another thing, back to the original question, are juries biblical? It depends on what is your purpose, and that's you got to define what is a jury. And that kind of, yeah, you know exactly where we're going.
Maybe I'm curious.
That's part of the problem with this person's article about why you shouldn't join a jury, because he is operating under the assumption that the jury is the one to judge and thereby sentence the defendant or prosecution. The purpose of the jury, essentially, and I know some lawyer friends are probably watching, but is essentially to advise or give counsel on the verdict and then make sure the sentence is properly done. So, for example, if you have a murder case, that's always the worst example I can give. If the person is guilty, the jury says, we believe he's guilty. Here's why. They don't need to elaborate. They're just saying guilty or innocent. The judge, though, is the one to give the sentence. So if the judge thinks the jury is wrong, he could say, you're innocent, get out of here. If the jury says, we believe he's innocent, the judge could say, you're wrong, he's guilty.
I didn't know that.
Technically, there's a lot more to that. But
the jury has undergone some evolution, though, so it's hard to say. It depends if you're talking about the jury as understood today versus the jury as
Right.
it was
I would say, originally intended to be.
And that's kind of where I'm coming from, the original.
But I think if you go from the idea of whether it's biblically justified, I think it would actually be literally on the precept of choose out from among you such men as fear
Right.
God. So really, when you're a juryman, you're a limited magistrate. You're operating as a now, very temporarily, but you are. Same case can be made when you're doing a citizen's arrest. What are you doing when you do that?
Mhm.
In the law, sometimes not only just allows you to, in some cases, it makes you culpable to do that. When the law makes you culpable, or it's your responsibility, in that sense, it's actually recognizing you as a magistrate in that
Mhm.
position. So, if we should have, say, surveys for jurymen, I would say, do you fear God? Do you love truth? Or do you hate covetousness? That's some of the things you could put in your questionnaire. The other one in my mind, if that's actually the case, the judge there is actually sitting not as the quintessential judge.
Mhm.
He's actually really he's an administrator in that
Right.
sense. He's making
Right.
sure that
Judge is
he's
really-
making sure things are working in an
Judge is
orderly
really
way.
just a referee.
Old American juries could change the law. If they
Right.
thought in that situation the law was unjust, they literally had the ability to say, it was called jury nullification. You say, we're nullifying the law. This is clearly a case where the law is being interpreted in a really rigid, wooden manner, and in this case it's actually being it's injustice if we were to apply it this way. And the jury was allowed to nullify the law. If you're doing all that, our nation was actually giving limited power to the jury to act as magistrates, and that's what you should see yourself as a jury. Is you're acting as in this capacity, you're acting as a magistrate,
Right.
and you should really have the due gravity of what you're doing. But today, sort of what you said, you're really just giving. Here's our opinion. Here's our unified opinion, and the judge most of the time is going to give sentence according to that.
Right, and as a footnote to my statement, usually that's a rarity that the judge would go
That is a
contrary.
possibility.
Right, it's possible. There's a lot more detail and ways of doing that,
I think he's wrong.
but you can check me and find out. But it is a rarity, and one of the reasons it's a rarity is because judges operate under a biblical principle where in the counsel of many there's safety. The purpose of a jury is to give counsel to the judge. That's the core principle there. Among other things, the jury is supposed to make sure the evidence is sound, to make sure the witnesses...
You're tried by a jury of your peers, not by a judge.
Right.
So you're saying the judge is, throw the jury away, the judge can decide the case.
No, because I think there is
And they
in the
can.
counsel...
There are certain cases where there is no jury, where you're tried by a
Right.
judge, but that is the legal counsel's decision,
Mhm. Right.
if they wanna go to jury trial. When there's a jury, I have never heard that the judge can overrule the jury's verdict.
It is rare.
I
But,
thought
yeah.
I never heard that
The-
was possible.
But the reason it's rare is because they operate, and that's my argument. The reason it's rare and almost never happens is because the court is set up where there are checks and balances within the court
I
room.
watched a lot of Perry Mason.
The
I didn't, but I thought that's funny.
the other
I watched
thing
Matlock.
the other thing that
Judge Judy,
oh yeah, that's the best. But the other core thing about what you were saying with judging the law, so I'll get to my personal example in a minute, but you usually have the sentencing, where is he innocent or guilty, and then part two, when the jury goes back into the room, depending on the case, they determine what the recommendation is to the judge on sentencing. And during that part two is when
Interesting,
they
that's
judge
only
the
a
law.
civil jury, too, not criminal. It's a civil jury.
So in the situation of a jury, there's a part one where they say innocent or guilty. Part two is where they determine what the sentencing is. And that's usually they're given, in my instance, the judge gives you the parameters of sentencing. Like, this is what you can, the maximum and the minimum sentencing for this. If you deem he's guilty, these are the parameters you can sentence him or her on. And then the jury goes back into the room, deliberate, and come back and say, this is what we sentence him to. So, in that situation, the judge usually follows suit and sentences accordingly. In my instance, it was in 2017. I can't explain all the details because I forgot many of them, but there were essentially 4 cases that this man was being judged on. One was reckless driving, speeding, eluding an officer, and then possession of an illegal substance. 1 ounce of cocaine was found in the
It
car.
was suspended license too, wasn't it?
Yes, that was driving with a suspended license, reckless driving. So there were like 4 or 5 things. And we had, in the jury room, 3 of us. Well, let me back up. During jury selection, the only question the defense had was, do you weigh the testimony of a police officer higher than that of a regular person? And if you raise your hand, it meant, yes, I do that, and if you don't, that means you're fine. And they had another question or 2 after that. But when we got into the jury room, we found out that a few of the jurymen actually were related to a police officer or a retired police officer.
Then you shouldn't have been on the jury.
Right. In my opinion, they shouldn't have been. But the defense and prosecution knew that prior to selection. Because they had the biographies. You had to do a little, all right, where do you work,
Yeah.
all that kind of stuff.
So it was okay. So the defendant was okay with it.
Yes.
So therefore, okay,
Right.
gotcha.
But in my opinion, I still would not have done. If I was the defense, I would not have had them in there. So during deliberations, pretty much everything was circumstantial evidence.
Was he being represented by a lawyer or himself?
A lawyer, yeah. Pretty much all of it was circumstantial evidence, but it was enough
Circumstantial if they arrested him while he was driving.
because they never actually saw him driving the car. They saw the car. It was at night. It was dark. He crashed into a tree, ran away. So by the time the officer got to
he
him,
was gone.
he was out of the car, and he was barefoot. So obviously, he was the one driving. There was no one within miles. It was dark. It was his mom's car. His shoes were in the car. Like, everything was... But there was no proof. There was no photographic evidence. Not that you need it. But there was no actual photographic or anything proof that he was the one in the driver's seat. Because his shoes were on the passenger side, neatly next to the ounce of cocaine. But they never presented evidence of a photograph or anything of the shoes next to the ounce of cocaine. They only had a photo of a close-up of the cocaine in a mason jar. So everything pointed to him being guilty, circumstantially. But the evidence presented to me did not pass the biblical test. So,
Maybe you would say for some of the cases, but not all of them.
right,
You could say
at least for the
driver.
the last one of the cocaine, it did not pass the test of scripture because there was only that close-up thing, and then the testimony of the officer.
As possession is problematic.
Right.
Basically, if it's just in your car, it's considered you possess it.
Right.
And that can be a problem because you can be literally possessing something you don't even know. But if it's his mom's car, how are you know if it's his mom's cocaine?
Right. And that
Could
was
be, you
that was
know, it's
part
like-
of yeah.
But the way the law is, like, it doesn't really matter as long as it's in there. Now you be to your knowledge by the law. If you have it in your car, you're possessing it,
Mhm.
and you're guilty of a crime.
Right. So circumstantial evidence is necessary in many cases because you can't have photos of everyone everywhere all the time. Otherwise, that's
And
police
photos are
state.
getting less and less reliable.
Right.
Really?
So-
Photoshop, deepfake,
Yeah,
deepfakes,
all that stuff,
starting to get to
and
the point where-
even DNA, even fingerprints. Partial fingerprint isn't as reliable now as it used to be. So yeah, it gets very complicated. So sometimes you have to rely on circumstantial evidence in order to say, okay, guilty or not guilty. The next step is the sentencing. Is the law being used properly to judge this person and sentence this person according to that law? And that's basically their argument. So the judge gives you the parameters. You have this maximum sentence, you have this minimum sentence for each of these crimes. And the judge in this instance specifically said, I'm giving you a copy of his prior record, because he had one, only for the purpose of seeing how things were sentenced. You cannot look at his prior record and judge him more just because he had a prior record.
They were allowed to do that.
The
I
judge
actually
was
think
wrong to
that's
give you that
completely
then.
prejudicial.
Yeah.
I think that's completely prejudicial to give you a
I don't
list
know.
of prior infractions.
Right.
But you're
under
not
the
allowed to use
guise
it.
of-
You're not allowed to use
How
it.
are you not gonna?
So,
there are a lot of
it-
people who think that way. It's like, oh,
Right.
throw the book at him. He's been done this before.
Right.
And it's like, well, that's not what
So-
you still have to judge it by this case.
But I do agree with the idea of giving examples.
Sure, but don't give
What
his
they
example.
should have- right. I agree. And that's where the contention came.
Yeah.
Was because once we got, so on the guilty not guilty, we decided to take a secret ballot vote because me and a couple others were like, this is all circumstantial, we don't have enough for everything, so we'll just do a vote on each individual thing and then come to a consensus on the majority opinion. So we all agreed on that, and that's pretty common actually, how juries deliberate. So we agreed, all right, he's guilty, everything is fine, we go back for sentencing. And that's when we were given the prior record. It should have been an anonymous thing, in my opinion,
Yeah.
and that's where a reform could happen. Just block out the names of who they
Yeah.
were, and when it happened, just say, all right, this was the crime, this is what he got, and then go down the list. And it was actually helpful because not all the time was that person given the maximum sentence. Some of it was the minimum sentence, which was either a fine or maybe a couple days in jail. But it wasn't the maximum. That was actually not even on the list. And so what happened was it tainted the well. It made people around the table say, well, he didn't learn his lesson last time, let's give him the maximum this time.
Yeah.
Which, for 1 ounce of cocaine in this instance, was 10 years. So, for 1 ounce of cocaine that didn't have a photograph of it in there, we could have legally been giving him 10 years in jail. And that's when things kind of got tight
It did, I would
between...
imagine,
Yeah.
yeah.
So, the other side in the jury room, it was found out that this gentleman, who was an African American, had a 10-year-old son. He was not married, but he had a 10-year-old son who his mother was taking care of. And my argument was, if we give him 10 years, this is how I was thinking, if we give him 10 years, his son is going to start the same cycle. You're going to throw this man in jail for 10 years for 1 ounce of cocaine, which circumstantially, yes, it was his. But he wasn't using it, he wasn't selling it.
He wasn't on high either.
He wasn't
He
high.
didn't have
No,
drugs
nothing.
and stuff.
Was not even drinking. He was coming home from work, whatever. We're going to basically have a fatherless child for 10 years. And a motherless child because she was absent. So, if you're looking at it from a biblical perspective, what did the verse earlier say about fatherless and widows? So, yes, we're judging that person who did that crime. But the surrounding circumstances show that if we judge the maximum sentence, we're creating a
What were the
fatherless...
circumstances of his arrest?
Uh,
Wrecked the car.
yeah.
Well, because he was driving with a suspended license. That's already arrested.
Yeah, I'm not going to say all the details because it's a
But
lot
you
more
said- but
elaborate.
You said he wasn't drunk or anything.
No. He saw the state trooper and he started speeding, so he was eluding the officer because he thought the state trooper was following
Okay.
him. But either way, so when I brought up my argument, like, this is just how I'm thinking, the room got pretty quiet. Somebody yelled at me because you're not supposed to look at surrounding circumstance, which is true, because if you have, you're supposed to judge impartially. So if a person is a pastor, you don't look at his pastorate and say, well, he's innocent because he's obviously an honest man. So just because there's somebody that might have a fatherless child doesn't mean that you judge them differently because of the child. However, in a biblical sense, you are judging the kid as well. You're creating another situation.
Yeah, but I don't
but-
think we should use that.
No.
It's like
No.
if you execute a murderer, rather, you're going to create an orphan. Doesn't mean that
Mhm.
you shouldn't execute murderers.
Right.
Well, and also, just for the sake of arguing with you on that, how do you know that young lad wouldn't be better growing up without his father?
That's true.
You don't
Yeah,
know
you
his
don't
father
know.
is a good influence at all.
Right.
And it could have been God's intervention to remove the father from that boy's life to have a better life.
Well, I think you could use an argument. I mean, obviously, I think giving someone 10 years for simply possessing cocaine is absolutely
It's not a
obscene.
just punishment.
Right.
Right.
So
I think
obviously,
that's
in some
That may
sense,
not, that may be the case. That is not a just, but
Right.
the law is there. Change the law if it's not a just case.
Right. But
Right.
you can.
In this case,
But in
they
sentencing, they're allowed in the sentencing. They're allowed to give the minimum
That's
sentence.
right.
So.
That's right.
But if they're considering the massive, if everyone's leaning that way, I wouldn't necessarily object to using circumstantial evidence to appeal to. You
Mhm.
know this is unjust as a sentence, or you know this is kind of crazy. We're starting
Right.
to get into the crazy sphere of
Just
sentencing
because
here.
it's on the books doesn't mean I want it to happen.
Right.
Like the story, I mean, this is fiction. The story of Jean Valjean from Les Mis, where he stole a loaf of bread and he got chucked into prison for years because he was hungry and he stole bread. That's not
It is a
just.
novel,
I know, but it was the first thought.
but it did happen.
But it
Right.
did happen historically.
could be-
Those types of
You
extreme
could be
punishments.
executing for poaching on
But
the
there's
king's
a
land, stuff
reason
like that.
that the one thing that a lot of young people are not looking at today, in the moment we are in the country, in the uproar that we are, there's a reason that those laws, and I'm not saying I'm for them or not, the reason those laws are on the books, and why crime has been steadily declining the last 20 years, because those laws are on the books, because things were so bad. And things weren't working, so this isn't working, so
Mhm.
we have to make it a little tougher. And again, every jury has a right, and every judge has, the guidelines are 1 to 10 years. You guys you guys pick, or
Right.
the guideline is, 10 years to life,
Right.
you guys pick.
Don't you think? I mean,
It's,
you
no, wait a
could
minute,
make-
it's not that because it's there you have to give it, but the fact that it's there isn't wrong either.
So here's
My-
Let me
right.
give you a hypothetical. Let's say I said maximum sentencing is cutting off your right hand. Do you think that would incentivize people not to commit the crime? It would. It would make the sentence just.
Mhm.
Wait a
So,
minute.
so yeah, you have these things. I would say because you said it's getting crime. We've sort of upped the ante on getting maybe harsher punishments to try to get the crime down. That in and of itself cannot be used as a justification because you can have very harsh sentencing, which would have the same effect, and I would actually argue it is harsh. Yeah, giving someone
Mhm.
10 years in the slammer for possession of cocaine is extremely harsh.
Yes.
Because they're not even high. They're not even, so they haven't done anything with it. They haven't endangered anyone. They haven't. You don't know how they use it. They don't know, and that all should be, being high should not be even if you were high. Now, if you're driving in a a school area, then you could say, hey, you were recklessly endangering people.
Mhm.
But that a 10-year sentence, like, I mean, you're
Right.
what
I'm
happens
not
to
So-
justifying the 10 years.
I know I'm not. I'm just
Can
saying it shouldn't
can
be
I
on the
jump?
law.
Can I jump in just
No.
before you? Yeah. So this goes back to the point of you're judging the law. When you're deliberating about sentence, you're judging which sentence is just.
Right,
This one isn't. It's too much.
Right.
It's not It's not a equal sentence to punish to crime. And it goes back to Proverbs 21. When justice is done, it brings joy to the righteous, but terror to evildoers. No matter what sentence you do, the person you're sentencing is not going to have joy. So that person, if he's guilty, is an evildoer.
he's gonna have
And that's-
joy if he gets a very light sentence and he was expecting a bigger sentence, and I'm not sticking with the
Right,
finance
right, right.
code.
Mhm.
But,
No, that's true. Like if
so he could
justice,
have joy.
right? Yeah, if he gets off
if what
completely
he's used to is
or
a miscarriage of justice, then
Right.
you could
No,
receive
no, you don't
joy
have to
by
go
it.
there, a miscarriage of justice. There's a
But
lot.
yeah, but it happens.
There's
so
a
it's
lot of
shame.
creeps out there.
Mhm.
There are a lot.
Yeah.
I was very involved in this. There's a lot of creeps out there,
Mhm.
and there's a reason why the pendulum swings back and forth.
Well, and to
I
your
also
point, with you're giving an unjust punishment to
Mhm.
this man would could compound other
people.
issues,
Yeah, other-
bad things,
It also creates a precedent.
destroying families
Right.
unnecessarily.
So your sentence, obviously, your motivation for sentencing somebody should not be, oh, what gives the maximum joy. That's not how you do justice.
Judge righteous thing.
But you also need to consider, when trying to figure out, is the law being used properly?
There's collateral damage.
Right. If you misuse the law,
But
if
there
you
always is,
Collateral
though.
damage for not punishing truly evil
Yeah, I
people.
agree.
Right,
too.
but,
Yes.
have to
but
agree
what
with
There is
about
no but.
but
There
I-
is collateral damage for not punishing truly evil people.
there's a but though, because if
Why?
you're unjustly punishing someone, you're creating bad collateral
Sure,
damage.
sure, but
Right.
that you should
Well, if you're
obviously
unjust,
then
well, why would anyone unjustly punish
right,
them?
exactly.
Because
So,
people are wicked.
but isn't that
No.
but we shouldn't be
yes,
looking
they are.
at
The Bible says so.
Wait, but
That's
we,
not, yeah, but that's,
we shouldn't be looking at the collateral. We should be looking at whether it's just to punish or
Exactly.
not.
No, I'm
Right.
I would say
saying-
literally that's the only
I'm
premise you should be
saying
judging.
that
exactly.
I'm saying that there is an issue there. Like when you sin, there's collateral damage.
Yeah,
if you're a
but
father and you
that's-
sin and you get
the
thrown
Bible-
in prison,
but-
guess what? There's collateral damage.
That's
The
right.
Bible gives specifically that you are
But-
not
but
to
wait a
give
minute.
mercy
But
to
wait a
a
minute.
poor person just
so,
because he's
but
poor.
you're saying that
Right.
if you're a father and you commit a crime, you know, a
Whether
couple
it's
seconds
against your
ago,
child, whether it's against,
but a couple collateral damage. That's right.
you
well-
should be punished.
Yes.
But you should be punished justly.
Yes. Well, and
And I'm saying if you punish unjustly, there's extra collateral damage that is falling onto to people unnecessarily.
let's
Like,
put
it's
it this
not
let's put it
I
this
would
way.
say I agree.
A-
in
a
this
simple-
case,
a
that judging
simple-
unjustly has bad collateral damage that
Right.
they should consider. And I don't think it would be
Like
unwise
there
to
are
bring that up in a
consequences.
jury room.
Right,
A
and
lot of-
and the purpose of using that point is to say that laws, when used improperly, or unjust laws used properly, meaning if you have a maximum or just say a minimum sentence for reckless driving was 10 years, that's an unjust law. If nobody was killed, if you're just in a highway somewhere, that's an unjust law. If that's the minimum sentence, obviously you need to change the law.
Sure.
But there is collateral. They're
Bad
on
ideas have consequences.
right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
What?
And bad ideas have consequences. Bad laws have consequences.
Yeah.
So when judging the law, when in a jury room debating how do we do this, you need to look at collateral of doing something improperly. If you're going to judge,
Well, you
if
have
you're
to
going to
look at
sentence,
collateral doing something improperly on everything you do in life.
and that's the point.
Final
That's why we're here, because if I'm saying,
It doesn't mean
Yeah.
you shouldn't try to do the best you can do.
I agree.
No, I am not advocating for
But-
shoddy work.
Yeah, well, you're never going to have perfect heaven-like justice on earth, but you will have stuff that is equal from sentencing. Hopefully that is the goal.
I'm wondering too if the whole reason why the law is there like pretty high at 10 years
Mhm.
maximum. I've heard of this before where laws are crafted to catch people that they know are sex trafficking, all
Mhm.
these things, but they can't get them.
Loopholes.
Right? So they create a maximum sentence for a lesser thing that they can get them
Like
on.
evading
And they hey, we can get a guy, we
taxes.
can get this guy, we know he's sex trafficking, we know it's sort of
Al
like getting
Capone.
Al Capone on tax evasion, right? It's like it's that kind of level
Right.
where some of these laws are kind of crafted. Are they really going to get
Well, we
maximum
don't know
sentence
that.
to like your average Joe on these? Almost never.
There's no reason. There's no way that we collectively can understand why laws are crafted the way they are.
And that
even
I think
lawyers
that's
do. That's the reason why we have an antagonist
but-
system.
but that-
right? It's
that's a good-
defendant and a
that's a good
prosecutor. The law
point.
is ambiguous enough that any two sides can argue.
let me. That's a really good point, because that's the problem. There are so many laws on the books,
That's right.
too complicated, but our standard
Hundreds
of
more
law.
today in Virginia.
Yeah, as of today, welcome to West or East California. But the standard of law is the Bible, so all of our laws should mimic the Bible in simplicity. So when I think it was Tyndale, when he did his Bible into English, he said, "I want the farmer, the common person, to be able to read it and know it better than the Pope or whoever, whatever the guy's name." So, and that shows that Tyndale wanted the common folk to know the law of God and its justice better than the scholar up there. So our laws should be simple enough.
Our founding fathers wanted the common man to be in the seat of government,
Exactly. It's a citizen statesman position,
supposedly.
supposedly. So, but
Which
we,
would solve a lot of these
our,
problems right here.
right. So,
We've
but
evolved, we've devolved, I'll say.
Devolved.
Since
But it shows how far we come as far as these laws are so complex. But another problem, why is there a maximum and minimum? Shouldn't,
Well-
depending on
I don't see
the
that as-
severity of the
Yes.
crime, that obviously you need something like that.
Yeah, because I think it's why you have to have judges, and to begin with, is because no situation really wouldnly fits often. We'd all love to have like picture perfect
Of
crimes,
course.
if you
Cut
will.
that right
Not
hand.
that you really want crimes
Right,
at all,
right.
but if you want them, you want there to be clear evidence.
Muslims do
You know,
that,
he's
right?
obviously
Cut
done
their
it.
hand off.
Let's do a hard sentence on.
Mhm.
But it's always hairier. It's like
Mhm.
there's never.
It's
I mean,
not
you said it with the Solomon case. I mean, you have two women alleging to have the same child, and Solomon has to judge whose child it is. And I think he's brilliant at how he deals with that.
Today we do a DNA test, but they didn't have that. So.
Exactly, but how he does it is
But
he
he has
just
a sword.
he
Right.
plays at something that your average person doesn't really try on their average day is not going to be thinking of. Is the real mother would never submit to the sentence that he's
Right.
about to give, and he uses the fact that he knows how mothers feel and how mothers should behave to determine who's actually the real mother. The one who wasn't the mother was like, whatever the king says, I'm gonna. And the real mother was like, give it to her.
Right.
She could not abide her child being divided before her eyes. And so by that, well, now he knows who the real mother is, and and it says that his fame went abroad because of that. But that shows you wisdom.
Mhm.
And to what was it your point? We're not all going to be able to understand it. I can agree with that. We're all endowed with certain levels of wisdom, and we're not going to be all adequately equipped to judge every case.
Mhm.
That's why we have a jury system to some degree. You're hoping that in a jury system, in theory, that you're getting the range of wisdom. You're
Our
hoping.
jury
Right.
system
Multitude
changed
of
because
counsel.
England didn't offer that.
Exactly.
Ours was
It was an
better, more
oligarchy.
godly,
Yeah.
and
Right. And that's
although
where.
now, we'd be better right now under King James than we are.
Well, I don't think that.
Hey,
But
I'm not actually. I kind
we're
of
getting
agree.
there.
I actually kind of agree.
We are at 8. So to wrap up, like
Well, I want to hear the rest of your thing. What
the
happened
the
to
rest
you?
of the story is that
I know it's a
the
cliffhanger.
yeah the cliffhanger part 2 is coming next week. No, but the end of the story was we were taking so long. There were only 2 of us that were like, we are not supporting maximum sentence.
Oh, the others wanted maximum sentence.
Everyone else, well, a few of them were just silent the whole time, but there were a few loudmouths that were like, we want to give the maximum sentence for everything, not even just the one,
So
for
it would
all
be
of them.
like, what would that be?
That would be
50 years?
10 years combined.
Plus whatever.
Yeah, plus some fines. So it was basically, we were starting to get to the point of, let's wrap this up, let's vote on this and just have a unified decision. When the bailiff comes in and is like, the defendant changes plea. He changed from innocent to guilty, so you guys are all free to go. And what that meant was, it
The
took it
judge-
out of our hands as
The
a
judge
jury,
has to do the sentence.
put it to the judge decides the sentence. And what did the judge do? He gave the minimum sentence for every single crime,
Well, good for him. I'm glad.
which was just a fine. It was a pretty steep fine,
Yeah.
but it removed it from being a systemic problem of collateral damage
I don't really know if
to
that's systemic though. That's just
well,
bad.
just
miscarriage of justice in this
yeah, okay,
situation.
that's better word.
Everybody's stuck on the
But
systemic
it
word.
sets
Yeah.
he mentioned before it sets precedent, so it
Right.
does like create
Instead of
yeah.
saying maximum for everything, which is what the jury
But they
wanted.
wouldn't have had that opportunity if he hadn't changed his plea.
Right. Like we were in there for hours.
I bet that's why he did, by the way, because when you're of a jury that's in there for hours,
Yeah.
they're not like
No, you don't. You don't know anything.
a defendant might. So I've heard this before. Like a lawyers can feel the pulse of things. So if the lawyer for the defense was like, that's too long, you need to change your plea.
Mhm.
Like, you get in long enough, you're like, that is not good
Yeah.
news for you. Or sometimes long could be good news for you, but in this case, a long jury chamber is probably not going to be good news for you. And if he has a good relationship with the judge, then he's like, let's
Right.
see if we can get the judge on.
So I was looking for the verse that you mentioned before about partiality to the poor.
Yeah.
So that would be a good verse for next time. But just to wrap this up, the verse that I wanted to use at the beginning with how swift should justice be is from James 1. So then this is talking about a very different topic, but I think it does apply. So then, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath, for the wrath of man does not produce the righteousness of God. So if you have the throne of God as a equal representation of righteousness and justice, you could also add, it does not produce the justice of God here, because both the righteousness and justice of God are foundations of his throne. And using this verse as a principle in the jury room, hear every argument, listen to all witnesses, all evidence, be slow to wrath, don't go to the maximum right away, deliberate properly, and be slow to speak. Don't be quick to condemn, don't be quick to say, this is what we're going to do, which a lot of people will do, and also have pity, because you're not slow to wrath. You're not going to say, oh, he's guilty. You're going to say, well, what if he's innocent? The innocent before proven guilty. What if all the evidence is wrong or pointing to something that we don't see?
Innocent before proven guilty, I don't think is biblical. That's part of our.
So
That's part of our.
guilty
I don't.
before proven innocent.
I don't
No,
know.
I disagree.
I don't know.
It just has to do
Prove-
with.
prove it to me that it's biblical.
I would say this. It just has to do with you have to treat someone that you have to have. Well, the Bible says without 2 or 3 witnesses,
Mhm.
you're not to go to trial with anyone. So
Yeah,
that is, you
the
actually
Bible.
have to have out of the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, let every matter be established.
Right.
So before you're in,
We didn't even get to
before
witnesses.
Yeah. So if you're in court. Let's say someone accuses you. That doesn't have any merit until it's actually
right.
sentenced. So, and that before that, you are innocent.
And-
right? There's
and
nothing
here-
in you.
here's-
in terms of the law. The law does not see you as a evildoer yet. Now, it might be you are, and the evidence can come down on you, or you're going to be.
And I know that's American law. I did not know if it's biblical.
I think
Right.
it
Me
is.
asking a
So
question.
here
it is,
in
I
the
think
example
it's-
in my example that I gave, the defendant only had himself and his mom as witnesses. So I kind of see that as just one
Sure.
plus the defendant. He was supposed to have his another person who kind of chickened out at the last minute, which would have been the key witness in my opinion. But on the prosecution side, they only had one witness, and that was the police officer, which is fine. There was other evidence, circumstantial evidence that could equal a witness, I guess, photos and whatnot. But if you followed the biblical litmus test of 2 witnesses, that's basically saying you need evidence or eyewitness or some kind of like proof that is so above bar that it's undeniable, and that's kind of the point of evidence, is it needs to be so above for proof that you will convict that person on the evidence if that person is found guilty. And that goes back to the slow to wrath and swift to hear, because you are listening to the evidence, you're listening to all, like, you're trying to eat in all that evidence and find out, is it above reproof? And if it's not, look for something else. So that I mean, I could go on and on about witnesses too, but
Yeah. I'd almost say in cases like that where actually doesn't even involve a victim, I would say always minimum sentencing for everything.
Mhm.
It's like whatever the law is on the books. Like if there's literally no victim in this thing, there's no restitution to be made. There's no victim. There's no. If anyone needs restitution, it's his mother who he wrecked his car, and if she's okay with it, it's like,
yeah.
who's the wrong? When you're in a case where there's literally no one wronged,
Well,
I
in
think
the
you've
sense
got to
of a
be very.
suspended license, he is evading a prior punishment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but you could argue. I mean, you still have bills to pay. You know, I get.
No, I get that. No, I
think there's somewhat of a.
No, I get it.
complication
No,
there. That,
no, it is conflict.
there's a reason he ran. He knew he was screwed. He knew it. Because you're a suspended license, so he knows he's like, crap, I'm speeding.
Really?
So
Really?
interesting thing about that.
I do that all the time.
Interesting, and we're really wrapped up. We're 10 minutes over. So interesting. No. Interesting thing about the suspended license. I think there's a parallel between suspended license and the verse at the beginning, of taking the widow's garment.
Yeah, there's a principle there.
What?
Of taking the widow's garment. If you take the livelihood of an individual away from him or her,
Yeah.
which in this case,
So you
his
think
ability
you have
to,
a suspended license?
his ability to go to work to pay off his
I
prior
understand that.
crimes.
Well, then find other ways to go to work.
Well, he couldn't.
Well, why not?
It
Because
does depend on the situation.
circumstance.
I think
Here's the
there are
thing.
some times where people
I mean, how
They-
many drunk drivers do you
right,
want?
and that's
I mean,
they
this is
put
bad.
Well, that-
people's
Drug
lives
yeah,
in
that's a
jeopardy
different
time
situation.
No, it's
after
not.
again.
You can't. People lose their licenses for speeding too many times.
Yes.
That's reckless driving, running
Which
stop
is
signs too many
this-
But
times.
is it, you know,
In
if I
Virginia,
go,
it's not really reckless.
yeah, if I go 10 over, I get, is that reckless? If there's, if
No,
I'm at
it's not reckless
nighttime,
at 10 over.
well, I'll say 15. Let's say I'm 15.
It's got to be more than 15. I forget what
I
it is.
think
Virginia.
they upped it to like
But
20.
you can lose your license for a certain amount of
I
perfection
actually got
stuff.
a reckless driving when the first months we lived here, and I was going to Farmville, and I didn't know I was doing 80.
Well,
right.
That's not the point.
But you
That's
can
not the
technically
point.
get
No,
your
wait.
license just for a number of infractions, right? And you don't always have aware of how many points are on your license.
Well, you should.
But you can't.
But
You
you
don't
do.
have it. But you don't.
It's your duty. But
You don't have it. They don't.
But
You
now
don't
wait a
access to
minute.
that.
a lot of people get killed on the roads.
Sure.
So it's not okay to say you should not suspend licenses.
It depends on what
A
it is.
drive, it does. Everything
But
depends.
should we
You
even
can
have
s-
driver's licenses?
you can-
That's
yeah.
another topic completely.
Well-
So, but to wrap up though, seriously, if the following General Assembly session, I think it was 2018, they revoked the law that allowed suspension of licensing for speeding.
Yeah, I
something.
agree with that. When I
And
saw that, I was
what
like,
that
yeah.
did was, if that law had been in effect, this man would never have been in court, because he only sped because he was afraid, because he knew he was driving with a
No.
suspended license.
Well, no, he was
No, he
initially
already had
pulled
a
over for
suspended
reckless.
license.
He had a suspended license,
Yeah, so what do you
so
mean he wouldn't
he's.
have been in court? Of course he would have been. He
Well,
already
no,
had a
no.
suspended
I'm saying
license.
if that law was in effect, where you don't get a
You
suspended
don't know what his
license.
license was suspended for
I do know
originally.
because I saw the evidence for it. It was in his prior record. We read it. I know those details. So, if he hadn't sped, the officer wouldn't have followed him, and if he hadn't had his license suspended, he wouldn't have sped. If. But that's what the evidence shows. So, I'm just saying that as a context of how there are good laws, there are bad laws.
So I do think you're getting at a point, though. If a poor man, let's say you're, you work a 9 to 5, you work paycheck to paycheck. You are, from American standards, that's poor. Now, here's why. If you can't make your bills, the difference between you being someone who's in an air-conditioned home with heating and it can literally go from that to where you have no place to live, right? Like, you're
Maybe you
paycheck
should
to
have thought
paycheck.
about it before you committed the crime.
But
Yeah.
doesn't this get back at harsh sentencing?
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, of course it does. Because if the Bible says the poor man's cloak cannot be used as a pledge, in other words, as collateral for a crime, my poor man is, in this case, I can't even pay my bills if I don't have a vehicle.
Right.
Right.
And a lot of times when you get a suspended license, you're allowed to drive to work, but nowhere else.
Okay.
A lot of times.
And so that would then appeal to the ethics of, okay, you've actually
So-
restored his cloak.
So you
I
don't
would
know.
agree with
So
that.
you don't know what this person's individual was. He may have been allowed to drive to
So
work,
I'm not
but he was
saying-
driving at a time when he wasn't supposed to be driving.
There's
Okay.
also pity.
We don't know that.
I'm not
And
speaking on this
mercy,
case particularly. I'm saying we're talking about suspended licensing.
Yes, and you can always,
and
unless
if
it's
that is the case, I
unless
think
it's
that's
a drunk
good.
driving thing, and even sometimes on drunk driving thing, they'll put it in your car. I'm very involved in a lot of this stuff,
Sure.
working with these at-risk kids.
Sure.
And
All I was
you-
saying is if,
And all I'm saying is I'm taking that away from you because
and
If
all,
you
because
get
you're
a
saying it
suspended
fulfills the
license-
equity of the law, and I'm saying
Yes.
that's all my issue was if this is the case, and you're saying, oh, it's not the case, okay, well, cool. I don't have any disagreement then. I was just saying if that would be a concern because you're taking away the bread out of that man's mouth, and that's his due, if you will, according to the law, and you should consider that.
So I'm gonna tie it up. We're a quarter after, so I'll just read one more verse
I'm
and
missing
then
Frasier.
yeah. Well,
Miss
we'll
Fraser?
we'll get to
Pretty
that.
show.
So I'm just gonna
Oh, okay.
read one more verse from Deuteronomy 32:4. Speaking of God, He is the rock, His work is perfect, for all His ways are justice. a God of truth and without injustice, righteous and upright is he. So we could talk forever on the justice of God, but it is not only that God is perfectly just, he is without injustice. There's no injustice, and that is heaven.
Right.
So, Jesse, if you could pray,
Yeah.
close this.
Father, we thank you for this time to gather to discuss the attributes that are given to us in Scripture of justice, of righteousness, of mercy. We ask you that the things we learn, that you would help us temper us, that we would be always trying to think your thoughts after you, that you would teach us out of your law, that we might be wiser than the ancients, that we might be wiser than our teachers. We pray that you would give us that, and we crave more understanding of your word. And we ask you that these